So I want to start this episode off with a question. And the question is, are we in control of our actions, or are we just reacting to forces that are outside of our control and that we cannot see? Is it appropriate to say that the forces that we cannot see amount to a cage in our lives? I know that sounds a little mysterious and esoteric, but we'll get back to it. Just stick with me, all right? There are two experiments that I want to build off of to open up this podcast. One of the experiments talks about external conditioning, the nature aspect of it, right? And then the second part talks about internal conditioning. I got that backwards. I'm tired. Let me start over. Welcome to the Tiebreaker Podcast. I'm your host, Ty, and we're about to get into this. So there's this psychologist who lived back in the early 20th century. His name was B.F. Skinner. And he made this very famous experiment. It's called the Skinner box. And basically what he did was that he took this box, and he isolated it from the outside, and he had either a rat or a mouse or a pigeon placed inside of these boxes.
The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box. One it quickly grew used to.
And there was a lever. And there were lights, all kinds of other stuff in there. But anyway, the mice learned to press the lever at a certain point in order to get food. The same for the pigeons. This was a way for them to use operant conditioning.
One piece of behavior, pecking a colored disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward.
Operant conditioning is basically a way of shaping behavior from consequences. So the mice learned that every time they pressed the lever, they would get some food. And then the pigeons learned every time they pressed the lever at a certain point, the same thing happened. So when I see this experiment, what comes to my mind automatically is slot machines.
One of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. A pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can.
So when you're in a casino and you're pulling the slot machine, it's only a matter of time before you maybe win something small or large or whatever, but whatever you do win, something happens in your brain. You get a pulse of dopamine, right? So that's one industry that takes advantage of this form of operant conditioning to entice consumers to buy their products. But there's also another industry that I wish more people were more aware of, because they're doing this right now as I'm making this podcast on millions of people, and that is social media. So if you look at your timeline, you probably don't notice that your timeline will go on for an unlimited amount of time. It's not limited. You can just keep scrolling and scrolling. It's like a Skinner box. You're pulling that lever, hoping for a hit, hoping to see a post that's going to cause you to get a dopamine release, that's going to get a reaction out of you. It could be something funny, sad. It could be even something enraging. That's a lot of the currency of social media. They call it rage porn, stuff to get you to be upset or angry. But for myself personally, when I'm interacting with these corporations, I try to be mindful of where I'm putting my money, because for myself, it could be as simple as, just because I'm putting money in this subscription, I'm kind of obligated to use it because I put money in it. You know what I'm saying? But I'm definitely not on social media like I used to be in back in the day. My Facebook is pretty much a ghost yard. YouTube, same thing. I definitely don't have YouTube tracking my history because I don't like being force-fed content. This is just some of the trade-offs that I've made in order to remain in control of my thoughts, my free time, and my ability to focus. Because a lot of times when we give ourselves up to these inventions with reckless abandon, we become enslaved to them. We find that we can barely get anything done. We procrastinate like none other, and we're getting older and older, but we're still doing the same thing we were doing 5 years ago, which is scrolling on social media or just binge watching Netflix or whatever you're doing. These companies got you, and they're using these psychologist principles to keep you hooked on their products. So yeah, I encourage my listeners to just be more aware of this, because you don't have to live like that. So with the Skinner box, that's an example of operant conditioning, where we're programmed to react in a certain way based off of consequences. But what about the stuff that is a part of our nature? And this is one of the things that I come across recently that really made me think. So just this year in March 2025, there was an author by the name of Dr. Lior Zimmergrad. She published a book called The Ideological Brain, The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking. And in this book, she investigates how physiology and biology influence our ideology and how we process and share information. That's a pretty radical concept, right? And there's a few reasons why people cling to ideologies. None of them are really good, but people do it nonetheless because it's what humans have been doing since the beginning of time. The first reason is that people need to understand the world that they live in. It's easier to just cling to a belief system that's been handed to you or something that you've come across that you didn't have to spend much brain power trying to come up with than it is to try to create new ways of understanding the world from the ground up or from scratch, right? And it kind of ties into the need for connection and belonging to a group, having a sense of purpose. Whatever requires the least amount of mental effort possible, that's where ideologies come in to fill that need. It's a way to lessen the burden of mental taxation or exerting yourself mentally. But the most pernicious thing about ideologies is that it diminishes our ability to separate fact from fiction. Because why do you have to have the skill of separating fact from fiction when you can just cling to an ideology? And that's why they're so dangerous, especially when they fall into the wrong hands, the hands of somebody who's not used to thinking critically and separating fact from fiction. So in Dr. Lior's book, she talks about a psychologist who was working in the 1940s by the name of Els Frankel Brunswick from the University of California, Berkeley. This researcher interviewed hundreds of school children, and the purpose of these interviews were to test their levels of prejudice and authoritarianism. So these came down to metrics like, do they value conformity, or do they value play and imagination, or do they value obedience instead above all? And once they scored the children, they were able to separate the children from groups of liberal children and groups of more authoritarian children. And then once they separated the children into these two groups, a story was then read to them. It was a fictional story about students at a fictional school. The students were given certain fictional characteristics. And then at the end of this story, the children who were separated into the authoritarian group and the liberal group were then asked to recall details of that story. And what the researchers found was that there was dramatic differences in how the story was recalled based on if the child was in the authoritarian group or if they were in the liberal group. And they found that the children who were in the liberal group tended to recall the story more accurately, whereas the children in the authoritarian group made up facts that weren't there, and they were just parroting kind of what they heard about the attributes of the students in these stories. They're very rigid in their thinking. That's kind of what they found. They weren't able to really speak outside of what they were told, whereas the liberal children were able to more easily use their own language and their own words of explaining the characteristics of these fictional students. The reason why I find this study striking is because everybody knows that when it comes to belief systems and ideologies, this type of teaching is instilled at a young age. But this particular research that was done in the 1940s was able to empirically show how that actually works. And I just think that's really cool to see. Another cool experiment that Dr. Lior highlighted in her book was how there were people who were, you could tell if they had rigid belief systems based off of how they completed a puzzle game. So in this puzzle game, people were told to solve the puzzle, and those who were rigid in their thinking were unable to adapt to any changes in the puzzle game. So for instance, if they were given one set of rules in the beginning, and then sometime during a puzzle game, the rules changed, the people who had rigid thinking or who were very beholden to ideology, they struggled to adapt. They usually did not adapt. And if they did, it was with great, tremendous effort, and they usually failed in that effort. Whereas the people who were more liberal in their thinking or more open-minded and less rigid, they tended to adapt right away with little to no effort. So that's striking as well, and it just shows, if that's playing out in a puzzle game, right? Or if it's playing out in students and their ability to recall accurate information, I think that adds a lot of context to what this country is going through today. A lot of Americans are being bombarded by a fire hose of misinformation. And if you're not trained to be able to separate fact from fiction, or good sources of evidence from bad sources of evidence, or if that's a value that you don't even intrinsically have, then you're very prone to being a casualty of this misinformation warfare that's going on. We are literally witnessing information warfare in the 21st century. And that's why I'm very cautious myself, because I'm not immune to this either. I value accurate sources of information, but I've been duped in the past, and it's just something that I don't take for granted. And I hope that whoever's watching this, that you don't take it for granted either. It's going to get worse, especially with the advent of AI and being able to generate these images from scratch with just a few types on the keyboard, a click of a button. I was on Facebook for some reason the other day, and I was seeing just the complete mess of AI that's already on there now. I'm like, wow, the AI is doing this at this time. What is it going to be like 5 to 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now? At that point, you basically really can't believe anything you see on the internet. It's going to be a very scary time to live in. And I hope that the world will be prepared, not just America, but the entire world. I'm not really sure if America could ever fully prepare for something like that, but at least it can mitigate the damage that's going to come from the fallout of these technologies that are rapidly coming upon us. So let me bring this back to the question I had in the beginning about the cage. These unforeseen forces of nature that are deep inside of us are how our brains are formed. It was found that people who have certain brain structures, like let's say their amygdala was more developed or more sensitive, and the amygdala regulates emotions and disgust and anger. And these are the types of feelings that a lot of conservative movements bring forth in people. So people who have a highly developed or overdeveloped amygdala, whatever you want to call it, tend to gravitate towards those viewpoints. Is that an example of a cage? Because everybody likes to believe that they have free will, or at least I like to believe that I have free will. But I know that there are things in my environment and things inside myself that are outside of my own control. But though I'm not in absolute control, I can still make an effort to be the best person that I can be. And I believe that for anybody. I don't think that anybody is beyond being able to acquire the critical thinking skills needed to survive in this world. And I just look at myself personally, like I used to be deep in conspiracy theories and just all kinds of information that I definitely wouldn't even try to go to today, right? I had to go through my own maturing process, and there are some things in my life that I had to go through for me to realize firsthand that there's a better way to be able to get a better idea of what kind of world we're living in without being knee deep in ideology and without being dogmatic. So it's possible. I'm a living testament to that. And maybe I can go into more detail about that in another episode. But let me know what y'all think about it in the comments about, are we caged in our lives to a certain extent by how our brains are formed, considering that people who have specific neural pathways in their brain that processes dopamine differently, these people tend to have more rigid thinking than other people who have neural pathways that process dopamine in other parts of their brain, right? It's that deep. And I think it's incredible because it adds so much context to what we're going through today. Like, I'm really starting to think that with what we're seeing the electorate do with our elections, or what we're seeing the electorate not do, I think it speaks to a bigger phenomenon than people just choosing to do what they want to do just for the hell of it, right? This stuff is deep. It's on a cellular level. If you enjoyed this episode, if you like this kind of content, let me know and I'll put out more content like this, because I like talking about stuff like this. And hopefully I gave you something that you could think about. You could check out those books I recommended. I'll put the description or the name of the author in the book in the description. Check it out. And I'll see you all in the next episode.